Let me welcome you. My name is Richard Hecht. You see me on the left with the Murakami flower, still fall here in California. And it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the first of our Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Jewish Studies Symposia for this academic year of 2022 and 23. We have scheduled for the symposium this year 10 events, and this is the first. And we usually have 6 to 7 or 8 events, but this year marks the second quarter century of this program. This is our 26th year, and I've been introducing our speakers for 26 years. And I've asked Professor Michael Hoberman to begin this 26th year, the second quarter century of symposia. And I want to say a word or two about him very briefly. Michael Hoberman received his BA from Reed College, and then he completed his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. As you saw on the flyer, he teaches American literature at Fitchburg State University. And among his books are The New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early America from 2011. And then a second book, 100 Acres of America. I love that title, 100 Acres of America, The Geography of Jewish American Literary History from 2018. And he's currently working on Imagining Early American Jews, Popular Representations of Jewish American History in the Contemporary Era. In the reminder of this event that I sent out on Friday, I also included a number of links to Professor Hoberman's articles. And what I found so fascinating about him is he has this incredible ability to find these very interesting Jewish literary figures or historical figures and to recontextualize them. So I think on one of the first links there I sent you was the article that he published on Judah P. Benjamin from Tablet Magazine, which is an utterly fascinating study. And it's written in such a crisp language that you immediately understand why Judah P. Benjamin is such an important figure for us to learn about. So Michael, it's a pleasure meeting you in person after 2 or 3 years of communicating with you. I'm delighted that we can have you speak on Paradise Remembered and Paradise Lost in the novels of Philip Roth and Allegra Goodman, and for you to begin this 26th year of the Taubman Symposium at UCSB. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I happen to be about a couple miles from, for better or worse, with Judah Benjamin from his childhood home here in Charleston, South Carolina. I've been attending the Southern Jewish Historical Society meeting this past weekend. So talk about recontextualizing, obscure and not such obscure figures from Jewish American history and literature. Here I am in the center of it all here in Charleston. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides that I'll be showing from time to time in the presentation. So you don't have to just look at me. You can look at these images that are meant to accompany my talk. And here we go with your first slide.
Michael,
yes.
Before you begin, I forgot to remind people to use the question and answer function to send us questions during your presentation and immediately afterwards. Please excuse the interruption, Michael.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Thanks. I'm glad that will be happening. So I'm going to be talking, as you know from the flyer, about these two novels, which were written within a year of one another in the late 1990s. But I want to start out with a little bit of a personal note and point out in a kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. I hope you'll appreciate it. You'll all appreciate it, that it's meant in that way. But I think of myself in a strange way as a species of Holocaust denier, not in the worst sense of the matter, by the way. But I want to explain what I mean by that. For different reasons, and despite their both having been born well before World War II, both of my parents were spared the direct experience of the Holocaust. And both of my parents, and this trickled down to me, had found different ways to keep themselves psychically separate from Jewish trauma. You'll see that my talk is a lot about how these two novels engages the subject of people who are trying to remove themselves from Jewish trauma. The story of my family, in a nutshell, is that my father was a second-generation American Jew. His parents came to the United States in the 1890s. That's a fairly typical American Jewish story. But my mother was a Sabra. She was born on a kibbutz that her parents had started in the 1920s. And so for two different reasons, on both sides of my family, I came from people who had, as I say, not faced the Holocaust directly, and through their lives really found ways to keep themselves separate from it and from other Jewish trauma. Growing up, I imagined that the Shoah had happened somehow or other to other Jews, the ones who were not prescient enough to leave Europe before Hitler's rise. So for better or worse, I guess I would say I grew up as an exceptionalist, a kind of exceptionalist. I imagined that Jews of my generation were somehow destined to escape the common fate of Jews everywhere else and through all the other eras of history. Now, I'm not the first person to fall prey to or take note of this mentality, of course, and the two novels that I'll be speaking about today, as I think about them, really touch in close proximity with this subject of Jewish people, particularly within America post-World War II, attempting to remove themselves from the larger story of Jewish history. The first of the two novels is American Pastoral, 1997. It was written, Philip Roth was 64 years old when he wrote it. For some reason, I think the age of the author matters here. By contrast, and I'll be talking a lot about the contrast between these two books, Catterskill Falls by Allegra Goodman, well, she was only 31 when she wrote that novel. I'll be talking about both of those books for their perhaps, as I think of it, inadvertent insights into an escapist Jewish American mindset that really, I guess, I would say, reached a peak towards the turn of the millennium. Both of these books are products of the late 1990s, which was a time when many Americans in general, but Jews in particular, Jews and Gentiles both, seem to have been especially susceptible to a kind of delusional and maybe ahistorical thinking about their future. Now, why do I say that they're speaking about this inadvertently? Well, first of all, for his part, Philip Roth, as I'm sure many of you are aware, spent his entire career trying to refute the notion that he was a Jewish American novelist in the first place. So I don't think he would have wanted to be associated with being a prophet of Jewish American, a Jewish American future or present. And for her part, Allegra Goodman, although she has certainly spoken and written about her concentration on Jewish American matters, I think, like any self-respecting author, resists the labeling of being a specifically Jewish American author. So I'm not claiming that either of these two novelists were necessarily keen to argue the points that I'm making today about their books and their books' particular Jewish implications. They didn't write these two novels in order to make a statement. But the critic's role, the role that I play as a critic, is not necessarily to gloss the intention of the author, but to look for connections and implications that might exceed the boundaries of the individual consciousness of either author. The people who wrote these two books were shaped by forces much larger and more powerful than their individual and artistic wills. In the rest of the talk, I'll be exploring both books' relevance to the Jewish American experience. I take their messaging on this subject to be both chastening and prescient, as I've mentioned. My remarks are also specific to the situation of Jewish Americans particularly, as I say, towards the turn of the millennium, when these books first came out in the late 1990s. I think, though, it might be worth considering, and perhaps this can be something we do during the question period, we could talk about whether and how their pronouncement resonate, these pronouncements resonate today. So I now go to the 1990s and ask you all to think about whatever associations you make with the 1990s. Of course, we've got 8 years of Clinton administration, but more particularly in terms of world history, and I think the events of world history are important here. We have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And then, of course, from a Jewish perspective of great importance, and again, these events are of symbolic importance, more perhaps than of real importance, because here you have Arafat and Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn, signing the Oslo Accords. But again, in 1993, when this document was signed, people didn't know what it portended. People may have thought, people such as myself, I was old enough to be very hopeful over that handshake. And then as a frame for all of this, in a symbolic sense, we have this book that I think emerged in 1989. The author, Francis Fukuyama, has, by the way, written a little bit recently about his second thoughts and reinterpretation of this pronouncement. But in 1989, Francis Fukuyama pronounced the end of history. And for me, as I think about what he was saying and the implications of it, for me, the end of history was meant to imply, again, a statement made at the end of the 1980s, the existence of a political and cultural consensus so powerful that people could actually stop worrying about what was happening outside their own countries, beyond their own borders, and instead concentrate on immediate, proximate, and domestic matters. The end of the hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States was taken as an indication that maybe we had reached that point. That's how Fukuyama interpreted it. Now, as an imaginative construct, right? These are all imaginative constructs. The end of history is certainly an imaginative construct. It bears an uncanny resemblance to the pastoral. And of course, the pastoral, you can understand from the title of the Roth novel that the pastoral is an important theme in what I'll be talking about today. The pastoral, like the notion of the end of history, the pastoral is a primarily literary mode whose tradition stretches back to ancient Rome, if not further than that. Actually, I guess the first, self-consciously pastoral poet is Virgil, the Roman poet Virgil. As a literary mode, it originates with Virgil's eclogues and typically would feature, in Virgil's case, lovesick shepherds lamenting the complexities of romantic love. Well, everybody laments those complexities, but also disparaging city life. Life of the enormous metropolis that was Rome itself. Now, skip ahead a few centuries, and you get to high-profile practitioners of the pastoral, such as William Wordsworth and other Romantic poets. Wordsworth, and this is an important concept here, that if Virgil was writing the eclogues in response to, in reaction to complexities of life in Rome, so too Wordsworth is writing poems about time spent in the English Lake District, because there's an industrial revolution that's affecting everybody around him in the rest of England. And for that matter, Henry David Thoreau, one of our better known American pastoralists, writing in the 1840s and 1850s, he's writing Walden at the very moment that a railroad bed is being built right through the Walden Woods. So the pastoral represents a return to simplicity and a reaction to perceived incursions of industrialism or modernism, things like that. A separation of the autonomous individual or the autonomous or traditional village, as we'll see particularly with the Allegra Goodman book, a separation of people from the entanglements of modern or urban life. Pastoralism in America in the 20th century, particularly in the post-World War II era, I think an equivalent word for pastoralism in some ways within the American context that we'll all understand is white flight, right? The movement of middle class and upper middle class white people, including Jews, to the suburbs. The pastoral, as I've mentioned, it's an imaginative product of desire, fantasy, longing, and nostalgia. Of course, it's not real. We know it's not real, but it's not the only fictional construct that has real consequences for people in their own lives, all kinds of social and cultural outcomes. Now, Roth's and Goodman's novels invoke the pastoral mode and bring readers' attention to the dangers that that mode poses, in particular for Jewish people in America. That's my contention. Now, the question should be asked, why should we understand pastoralism to be at odds with Jewish literature and Jewish literary experience? Why can't Jews be pastoralists like everybody, like Romans and English Romantic poets? My understanding here is that it's because the pastoral mode, particularly in the sense of referring to an elimination or a removal of the individual from the larger sphere of life, it threatens Jewish communal survival, which has always been a function not only of a sense of community, but of a pattern of engagement with, not withdrawal from the outside world. In other words, Jews don't gain anything by trying to escape modernity. Other people might think they gain something, but in Jewish history shows us that an escape from modernity is not necessarily a positive move from a Jewish communal perspective. The pastoral also, schematically, as you'll understand, privileges place and space, right? It's a mode that always involves some kind of engagement between an individual and a landscape, a physical landscape. But those of us who study Jewish culture and history understand perhaps that for the Jewish experience writ large, time has often been understood to matter more than place and space. That doesn't preclude space and place from mattering in Jewish perspectives, but there's a greater engagement on the part of Jewish writers and participants in Jewish literature throughout the world in the sense of time and history. Now, how I came upon these two novels in the first place was, I mean, other than as a casual reader, I read them both when they came out in the 90s, but I wasn't really thinking about them in any particular way then. How I came upon them as a worthy theme was that I was writing a book. Richard mentioned it in his introduction, and I'll speak about it a little bit later. I was writing a book about the sense of place in Jewish American literature and the ways in which Jewish American writers have, in different ways, engaged American landscapes. Now, while it's often invoked by critics of American literature, the sense of place is, as I've already hinted, not necessarily an expected preoccupation for Jewish literature anywhere, certainly anywhere outside Israel. However, as I found in writing this book, and I'll speak more about it later, Jews typically have, because they've been configured as immigrants, as itinerants, and as primarily urban focused, have often been disassociated in the popular imagination from place and space. I wanted to write a book that would challenge that. So for what it's worth, the theme of place is central to the ideas that I want to get across about the two novels. All right, let me get into these two books. Now, superficially, they could not be more different from one another. You already saw that Roth wrote his book when he was twice the age of Allegra Goodman. So even just in terms of the age the authors were when they wrote them. But let me give a little bit more specific background on how these books are very different from each other before I talk about what I consider to be the remarkable points of convergence. So American Pastoral, I'm guessing some of you, many of you are familiar with it. It depicts the unrest and violence of the 1960s. Its central climactic moment is the explosion of a bomb in a post office. I'm showing you here an image from West 11th Street in New York City in I think it was October 1969, when a bomb that the weathermen were building in that townhouse blew up. And so one of the main characters in American Pastoral is a young woman who gets involved in the violent anti-war movement. The protagonist of American Pastoral is a Job-like tragic figure whose fall from grace occurs against the backdrop of this violence and other social changes that the United States was undergoing in the 1960s. The main characters in this book are either secular Jews or, for that matter, they're not Jews at all. Again, I'm trying to build a contrast between American Pastoral and Allegra Goodman's book. The protagonist marries a Catholic woman, so technically, well, not technically, halakhically, in every kind of way, their child, the one who sets off the bomb, is not Jewish. Among other things, Roth's novel is about intermarriage and assimilation. The central character, who's nicknamed the Swede, is a Jew who's obsessed with becoming an American. And at the end of the book, as his cynical brother Jerry points out to him, his attempt to become one with America launches him right into the heart of what Jerry refers to as the American berserk. The family, the Lvov family, is destroyed by that experience. As a whole, I would say Roth's novel is eventful, it's tragic, it's loud, it's disturbing at every turn. Now, contrast that with Catterskill Falls. It's set in the 1970s. It was, in its own way, I guess, a noisy decade, but not, I think, in the popular imagination, not particularly cataclysmic. Half of the novel takes place in Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan, in an Orthodox enclave in that part of New York City. The other half takes place in a small Catskill town that in the summer plays host to the same Orthodox community. The Orthodox community is called the Kirshner community. That's the name that Goodman has conferred upon these people. And here you have, I'm imagining this, there is an old synagogue that the Kirshners use in their Catskill town, and perhaps it looked something like this one, which is taken from, I forget which, it might be, I'm not sure if it's Catskill, New York, where this old, let's say, early 20th century synagogue is situated. The main characters in Catterskill Falls, by contrast with American Pastoral, they're not only Jewish, but as I've already made clear, Orthodox in their practice. For the most part, I should say, not only content with their orthodoxy, but quite eager to perpetuate it, to keep it alive in future generations. Where Roth's novel is built around the tragic experience of an individual, Catterskill Falls takes shape around the life of a community. That's another point of contrast. The main players in Catterskill Falls are young, old, male, female, and its main plot line, which is simply its character's journey through time, and particularly through the rhythms of 2 Jewish liturgical years. It's not a very plot-driven novel at all, unlike Catterskill Falls. Critics described Goodman's novel when it first came out as Austen-esque, as in Jane Austen. In other words, it's a book about relationships as opposed to events. And in fact, I was fortunate enough to meet Allegra Goodman a few months ago at an event that I moderated with her. And she made clear, and I asked, one of my questions had to do with her writing of that novel so many years ago. And she said to the audience, I wrote Catterskill Falls because I wanted to write a 19th century English novel. So that was what her intention was. Reading the novel is a highly satisfying, but certainly not a pulse-raising experience in the way that reading American Pastoral would be. Our study and contrast between these two authors, of course, could be drawn out further, but I'm not going to bother, in terms of the lives and careers of these two authors in contrast with one another. Of course, I never had any contact with Philip Roth, and I'm sure that if he had lived to see to coincide with my interpretation of American Pastoral, I doubt he would have taken a look at it, which is not to say he's not a great novelist. Allegra Goodman, again, by contrast, when I wrote the article in Tablet Magazine about this, my comparison of these two novels, she actually wrote me a personal note over email thanking me for my interpretation, which, again, it's not fair to put Roth, who is posthumous, in comparison with her, but I just cannot imagine Philip Roth sending a personal note to a totally obscure literature professor about an article that they wrote about his book. All right, so let's get to the parallels. After all, it's the parallels that really matter here. The parallels between these two books, aside from the fact that they're written around the same time. And I will address this issue of the late 1990s. I'll continue to talk about that. But the central convergence between these two books is fairly simple and has to do with the setting. And that, in fact, is how I came to find these two books. As I mentioned before, I was writing books about Jews. I was writing a book about how Jewish writers engage with the idea of landscape and place. And here you have these two novels, both of which are set in the forested hills of the northeastern United States, more specifically in Roth's case, northern New Jersey, and in Allegra Goodman's case, the Catskills, as we've mentioned. Now, while setting can often be an incidental feature in fiction, I would argue with that with these two books, particularly, again, if you take to account even just the titles of the books, Catskill Falls, American Pastoral, that the setting matters an awful lot in both of these books, perhaps more than anything else. The titles hint very strongly at the importance of place, as I mentioned. But beyond that, the characters, the protagonist in American Pastoral, the set of protagonists, the Kirschners in Allegra Goodman's book, they make deliberate choices to live in these seemingly tranquil, quiet, and withdrawn locales. It's worth noting, by the way, that the two settings, the Catskills in one case and the hills of northern New Jersey in another instance, they're not only beautiful to look at, right, with autumn foliage, as you can see, and that kind of thing, but they also happen to be landscapes that are sort of sanctified, have been sanctified by events in early American history. In both novels, you have the authors address the fact that these are historic landscapes that where eventful, important events in history, let's say before the Civil War occurred. And that's one of the reasons that the landscapes matter so much to the characters who are inhabiting those landscapes. Here, for instance, this is a Revolutionary War house somewhere within the confines of Morristown, New Jersey, which is evidently the setting that Roth more or less had in mind for his protagonist, the Swede Lavad. The Jewish characters featured in both novels inhabit and immerse themselves in that early history and its surrounding mythologies. And of course, the mythology is maybe more important than the history. Because the history itself is consistently described to readers as a kind of a fantasy land, however, we discovered that in moving to these places, the characters themselves cut their ties from the vitality of American and Jewish life. The Swede, the protagonist in American Pastoral, wants to cut his ties to his Jewish origins and wants to align himself with his WASP neighbors. In fact, this is his idea of paradise. And it's if you look in American Pastoral, you'll notice the sections have different titles. It's a curious but understandable thing that in the opening section of American Pastoral, Roth refers in which Roth offers a glowing, beautiful, just heart-stirring description of the Jewish ghetto in Newark in the 1930s. That's the section of the book that he calls Paradise Remembered. So from the perspective of Roth, I think, from the narrator's perspective, paradise is the Jewish ghetto. For the Swede, for his protagonist, paradise is a house like the one on the screen there. The Kirschners, for their part, they're not interested in making cause with Jews outside their own sect, let alone WASPs. So there's a difference there. Whereas the Swede wants to be like his Christian neighbors, the Kirschners have no particular interest in doing that. But they are, for that matter, not interested in making common cause with any other Jews. They look down upon the local, sort of the year-round Jews, who the ones who built that, would have built the shul that I showed you a picture of. And for that matter, and this is, I think, quite significant, they are anti-Zionist. And that comes up several times in the novel where, in particular, there's some young girls who are part of the cast of characters who are interested in Israel and want to get books about Israel. And also the novel takes place against the backdrop, among other things, of the raid on Entebbe in 1976. And the parents are eager to get the newspapers out of the hands of the children because they don't want their Kirschner children to really know anything about or much less form any affinities to Israel. So in both cases, you have people who are cutting ties between themselves and a larger community beyond them. The novels give us individuals, as in Roth's case, or communities, as in Goodman's case, in flight from modernity and failing to engage with an outside, and by the way, of course, this is quite important, an increasingly multiracial world that surrounds them. The contrast between these characters' bucolic aspirations and the post-industrial degeneracy that surrounds them, for instance, Newark in the 1960s, Upper Manhattan in the 1970s, or I think actually this is 1986. The contrast between the worlds that they want to get away from by going off into the hills and woods, and the world that they actually seek to inhabit is profound. Both novels place their thoroughly modern and internally conflicted protagonists against the backdrop of these mythically informed bucolic pastoral places. To me, it's a hint that there's something that's not right, either for the community in Allegra Goodman's book or for the individual or the family in American Pastoral. The choice of setting hints strongly at an old theme, by the way. This is an old theme in American literature, not so much Jewish American literature, but American literature in general, and that is that the notion of geographic removal as an escape from social responsibility. Of course, the most famous instance of that for most of us would be, at least until recently, those of us who read Huckleberry Finn will be familiar with what happens at the end of that story when he has to get off the raft and go back home. He decides he's going to light out for the territory, which is to say, go out west to get away from his aunt, to get away from civilization. Huck is one of many American, almost exclusively male protagonists in 19th century American literature who seek to escape from women, from society, from cities, from anything complex into the wilderness. Rip Van Winkle is another case in point, and actually Rip Van Winkle makes an appearance in Catterskill Falls, understandably, since that book takes place in Rip Van Winkle country. So again, to bring it back to a Jewish story, escape from social responsibility is a Jewish anathema, at least as I understand it. Both novels seem to me to be warning readers that Jewish life in the United States, by the time that the novels emerged in the late 1990s, in particular within the framework of white flight, removal of upper middle class Jews to sort of bucolic settings, and if not bucolic settings, certainly to the upper echelons of economic stratification, that Jews were reaching the brink of irrelevancy in making that move. And both novels feature quiescent, self-indulgent, withdrawn characters and communities. Attention to the ways in which both of these novelists describe and invest meaning in their settings is what brought me to that conclusion. Now, let me take a moment to talk about setting, and in particular setting, American Jewish writers and setting. I'll tell you a little bit about the book that I wrote in order to get to this point. So as I mentioned, I was writing this book about how Jewish writers going back to the mid-19th century engage with American landscapes. The dominant theme, as we've mentioned, for so much of the critical literature about Jewish American literature would suggest that Jews are an immigrant population. And in my book, I wanted to challenge that notion, given the fact that in some instances, for instance, here in Charleston, just the other day, I went into a synagogue, the old synagogue here in Charleston that was, the congregation originates in the 1740s. I met a woman whose ancestors came here to Charleston in 1791. So Jews aren't immigrants anymore than anyone else is an immigrant. And so I wanted to write a book about how multi-generations or just a few generations of Jews no longer are people coming to America, but should be understood as a group of people who come from America. And one of the ways in which people come from and manifest their coming from a place is by feeling connected to the landscape of that place. I was prompted to write this book not just by my academic and intellectual interests, but frankly, by my personal proclivities. I grew up in New York City. I already told you a little bit about my parents, but I grew up in New York City, and as proud as I am of that fact, and I grew up in New York City at the, basically at the time you see this photograph in the early and mid 70s. That was my time period in Manhattan. What a great and exciting place to be. Not if you were me. Not if you were me. I wanted to be out in the countryside. And I left New York City at a relatively young age, and I haven't lived in New York City for many, many years. In fact, one of the reasons I went to college in Oregon was to get away from that urban place. So what I want to say is I'm no less susceptible to this pastoralism than the characters I'm talking about. And for that matter, after I completed graduate school and had the wherewithal to do it, my wife and I bought a little homestead in Western Massachusetts, and I still live there. So I'm one of these people. I'm one of these pastoralists upon whom I'm casting aspersions. Now, the book I wrote is called 100 Acres of America, as Richard mentioned, and I'll speak in a moment about where that line came from. It comes from American Pastoral. But in that book, I talked in various chapters. In the first chapter, I spoke about two mid-19th century American Jewish writers who crossed the West and described California in the 1850s. I also, in the second chapter of the book, I looked at some turn of the century, that is turn of the 20th century histories written by amateur Jewish American historians, each of which all of these histories attempt to show how, or not attempt, I mean, I guess you could say they succeed in showing how Jews during the colonial era were really instrumental in the establishment of the oldest American cities, places like Charleston or Philadelphia or New York, in a way, basically claiming the urban landscape as a historically Jewish landscape. I also have a chapter in the book about post-World War I, two post-World War I Midwestern and upstate New York authors, Jewish authors, who glorify small town life from a Jewish perspective. And I would say that these first three sections of the book those are the happy parts of the book. Those are the parts of the book where the writers seem to love their subject matter and seem to be very enthusiastic in particular about the landscapes they're describing. Even the small town Jews who underwent, what you wouldn't be surprised to hear were anti-Semitic episodes, were proud that they'd grown up in small towns and felt that as Jews, they had helped to modernize those small towns. But when you get to the post-war period, interestingly enough, exactly when the material lives of Jews begin to improve, that's when the morale seems to go south. Post-war prosperity is an important historical turning point in how Jewish Americans relate to North America as a place. The way I understand that is that until World War II, Jewish American writers were aspirational. They were immigrants, or at least thought of themselves that way. They were outsiders seeking entry into the culture. And ironically, this gave their writing a kind of optimistic and affinitive quality. They wanted to find ways to embrace these alien landscapes. They wanted to find ways to fall in love with them. They did fall in love with them. And so their writing really glorifies those landscape spaces. For that matter, as Jews, they were more or less dovetailing in some ways with existing American literary trends about the frontier and urban areas and small towns, and in also ways innovating in little bits and pieces. So for instance, the Jewish take on small town Midwestern life is that goes back to the fact that Jewish families who came to Midwestern towns were mostly retailers who had urban connections. So their small town was not the same small town of the farmhand or factory worker who was constrained to live in that town and never get to leave it. But when you get to the post-war period, that rise in prosperity, higher levels of assimilation, admission to educational institutions and the professions and so on, in a strange way, that event, that turnaround, brings the vibrancy that I've been speaking of to an abrupt halt. Ironically, now that they no longer have to jostle to gain entry into American society, Jews find themselves missing a vital ingredient. And that vital ingredient is a sense of history rooted in the struggle to fit in. It also a contributing factor here is that in the post-war period, American Jews are witnessing the creation of Israel. So there, over on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe, other Jews are creating a new society in their new home, in their ancient homeland. The European Jewish community has been all but liquidated. American Jews, their new world in the post-war period is the suburbs. But having broken free of their working class and ghetto roots, they're suddenly untethered from the past. And Jews without a sense of history, in a certain sense, are missing something intrinsic to being Jewish. If existing on the margins of society, as they once had, was inconvenient and straining, at least it resonated with earlier periods of Jewish history. In the post-war period, another way to put it is that Jews became white people racially in America. And second, third, and subsequent generations of Jews, what they had in common at this point was not really embodied by what they had in common as Jews was not really embodied by firsthand experiences. They had an immigrant ancestry, but second, third generations and onward were not speaking Yiddish in the home. They had a memory or a sense of a connection to the Holocaust, which I mentioned at the beginning. But by and large, the Holocaust was something that happened to the cousins of American Jews, but not necessarily to them. They had an affinity to Israel, particularly through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, a place that some of them visited and supported financially, but they didn't have these vital connections. I won't be the first person to tell you that in an ironic and strange way, a relative absence of anti-Semitism often poses a threat to Jewish unity. And I think that in some ways, these books are talking about that. Now, let's get back into the novels. The fourth chapter of my book talks about these two novels, and particularly within the context of this anomie of American Jews that I've been speaking about. The suburb and exurb during the 1960s and the present. As barriers to Jewish assimilation in the United States fell, people like the Swede in Philip Roth's book wanted to meld themselves to their idea of who and what a real American was. In his case, in the Swede's case, he's traveling back, I think, from a baseball game on the bus back to school, and he passes an old stone house on the back road in New Jersey, and he decides at that point he is going to buy 100 acres of America. He's going to become an American by possessing a piece of America. By eschewing the city, and for that matter, the tract housing of the suburb, when he marries his wife, who's the recent Miss New Jersey, he declines the option to move into a suburb outside Newark where other Jews live. No, he wants to live out in the countryside. He wants to be a Daniel Boone or a Johnny Appleseed. And he actually references these characters from American mythology. The notion on his part is that the pastoral dream that gives the novel its title, the problem is that the pastoral doesn't fit well, as I've mentioned, with the Jewish experience. In Jewish literature, we're used to the idea of exile and return, but pastoralism serves individual and not communal interests. So now I want to get into some material from the books, and the pages I'll be pointing out are pages that were part of the PDF that Richard sent to you all. And so we'll start here with this section from American Pastoral, in particular, where the Swede, I guess it's better if I look at my page on the actual page here. The Swede speaks to his wife, and he says, why not? I'm looking at the bottom of page 307. Why not? 100 acres of America, land first, cleared not for agriculture, but to so he goes on in his imagination. Roth has the Swede, the wheels of his imagination are churning with a barn, a mill pond, a grist mill, and so on. He's enthralled by the fact, among other things, that the house that he's got his sights on, the stones of that house were built out of the circles that Revolutionary War soldiers had their fireplaces in. And so he is not only moving out into the countryside, but he's also kind of imbibing American history as he does so. The question that I have here, the questions that I would pose are, first of all, what is the main character being inspired to do by the sight of the house? And it seems that what he's being inspired to do is to cut his ties to the Jewish past, right? And this is exactly what he says towards the end of the passage on 308, where he says to his wife, Dawn, we're married, we can go anywhere, we can do anything, Dawnie, we're free. So that's the freedom that he's seeking. So he's been inspired by the physical encounter with the landscape, by the psychic encounter with the landscape. The source of inspiration is the place itself. The landscape, in other words, the setting, is what drives him, what inspires him to do this thing that in the end of the novel, we find out to be a very dangerous, self-defeating thing. Now, in Catterskill Falls, something analogous occurs at a point about a third of the way through the novel, where one of the main characters, Elizabeth, is visiting the museum where Thomas Cole, the house of Thomas Cole, who was, of course, the famous 19th century Hudson River School painter. And she looks at this painting of Catterskill Falls. That's, of course, why the novel has that name. She rushes over to examine the painting. She loves it. She's seen this painting before, but it just blows her away. And by the way, here's the slide of the painting itself to go back. So this is the painting that she's looking at as in this passage. The place is more dramatic on canvas. Of course, she gets lost in the painting to bring it to shorten things up here. She gets lost in the painting. The painting reminds her of a time when she was walking through that same landscape by the Catterskill Falls, and she fell in a pile of leaves, and she lost her footing, and she just didn't even care about anything anymore. She loves the place. She loves the painting by association. And at the end of that chapter, at the end of the paragraph here on 83, she decides to do what seems to be a very innocuous thing, which is to open her own store. But that, in fact, her opening of that store poses a great threat to the community that she's a part of. In other words, this dream, this pastoral dream that she falls into, is exactly what inspires her to do something that may have the tendency to create a rift in the community that she's a part of. Again, what was she inspired to do? She was inspired to withdraw, to cut herself off, and to live in a dream. And what was the source of inspiration? The source of inspiration was not just this bucolic American landscape, but also the history that she associates it with. That is the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole, and so on. Now, let's go to, we've seen the painting. Another passage from Allegra Goodman in this case, and that is a scene in the book where the patriarch of the community, the Rav, watches his people. This is, I think, in Washington Heights, and he's just watching his people pass up and down the street. But what he sees as he watches these people is that they've lost something. And you have the PDF, so you've had a chance to consult it, hopefully. What he thinks that they've lost is something vital that they had in Germany before the war. They don't have it in America anymore because America invites them to be individuals, invites them to be not just perhaps individuals, but invites them to celebrate their orthodoxy within their own circle without any need to be connected to anything bigger. In Germany, even the most Orthodox Jews, from the Rav's perspective, were part of German culture. But here, his kahila are really, they're by virtue of living in America and the freedom of religion that they're afforded. The other side of that freedom of religion is that it cuts them off and invites them essentially to separate themselves from the rest of Jewish life and from the rest of American life. So also in Catterskill Falls, it was notable to me in any case, that the separation that the Rav is talking about, that he laments, there's some significant dates here. First of all, the year that the Kirshner community decides to buy this set of cottages in the Catskills happens to be 1948. And of course, 1948 from a Jewish perspective is the founding of Israel. So at that exact point that Israelis were founding the first Jewish state since Bar Kokhba, the Kirchners are creating their own little, are attempting to create their own little sovereign realm in the Catskills. And then another date that comes into the book, actually most of the action of the novel itself, where the characters are interacting, that's 1976. Of course, the bicentennial comes into the action of the book. We see some of the bicentennial celebrations. So declarations of independence are important here from a symbolic standpoint. In both instances, the Swede is declaring his independence from his Jewish past, and the Kirchners are declaring their independence in a way from everybody except themselves. I'll show another passage briefly from American Pastoral, just to emphasize the delusion that I think Roth sees, the delusion that underlies the thinking on the part of the Swede. This is a description from a few pages before the passage I showed you earlier, where the Swede and one of his WASP neighbors, who happens to be a lawyer and an amateur history buff, the lawyer takes the Swede on this tour of the hill country that the Swede is now attached to. What was fascinating in this passage on 302, you'll see that everywhere they go, it turns out that this pastoral dream really is a dream, because all of these landscapes described on page 302 involve industry, and not just industry, but also warfare, right? We find out that arms were manufactured at Picatinny, arms for World War II, at the Kenville plant. There were rolling mills and forging shops, and axles and wheels and rails were being produced here. The point being that what the Swede interprets as a quiet, bucolic, hilly, waspy landscape, actually that landscape is the remnant of an industrial landscape. In other words, industry and pastoralism are intertwined. You can't get away from industry. You can't get away from urban life, because urban life is what creates America and modernity in the first place. So it's an artificial separation that the Swede is trying to bring about. The protagonists, I'm going to conclude shortly here. The protagonists here really are united by their fears. The Swede doesn't want to move to an ordinary suburb because he doesn't want to lose his dream of an American self, a triumphant self. In Catskill Falls, the community fears its loss of communal autonomy, and they too cut themselves off. The characters in both novels are united by their belief in fairy tales. In Rip Van Winkle, in a line from Goodman's novel, the idea that there are secret forests where you can become someone else. Now, I mentioned the late 90s, right? The years that these books came out. In 2000, Robert Putnam published the very significant book, Bowling Alone, which really speaks to this in a larger frame of a phenomenon within American culture, not specific to Jews, of individualization, the dearth of communal structures, the sense that people are cut off from one another. And of course, I think, it's only that those conditions have only deepened in the 20 years since the publication of these two novels. Grace Paley, of course, a very significant Jewish American writer. I'm not sure if she would want to have called herself that or not, but she once wrote that Jews don't take up space, but continue in time. I think that was her perception. And what we have in these two novels by Roth and Goodman are novels about Jews who want to escape time into space. And of course, it's understandable that these characters and communities do this because it's so strong. It's such a strong pattern within American literary tradition of individualism and characters going out, like Huckleberry Finn did, into the territory to remove themselves from uncomfortable and complex problems in their lives. Just very quickly, maybe some of you read this article that I think Richard included in the email to you all, but if you want some follow-up and flesh on these bones, you can read. You don't have to read 100 Acres of America. That'll take you a few days to get through. You could read this article in tablet from about a year and a half ago that I wrote in this very same subject. Thank you so much. And I hope that there's still time for some questions here.
Thank you very, very much, Michael, for this extraordinary presentation. And I want to see if I can get myself back on the screen with you. There we go.
I've stopped the share.
Thank you.
So
thank you.
I'm no longer dominating the screen with my pictures.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. Really, really extraordinary. And I have a couple of questions, but we actually have 4 questions, but 2 of the questions come from one individual, and the 2 other questions are related. So I'm going to start by putting 2 questions together. So one of our viewers, and I think I know who this is, but he writes, "It's not for Roth. The fundamental theme is that Jewishness equals being conflicted. For Roth, as a Jew, you cannot escape." And then there's more. Just let me read the second part of this. For Roth, no matter where you go, what you do, there is conflict, and you are destined to be conflicted as a 1960s 20-year-old in the city or in the country in the 1990s.
I think that person is absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really meaningful takeaway from Roth and all of the Roth novels that I've read. For me, a passage. I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable talking about it because, like so much of Roth's writing, it's very sort of masculinist and also sexualized. But in The Counterlife, there's a passage towards the end of the book where the protagonist is trying to rationalize to himself why things didn't work out for him in England with his attempt to be an English person, and why things didn't work out here and why they're not working out there. And it all comes down to circumcision for Roth. Circumcision is the act according to which God separates Jewish men from the world around them, separates them from nature and from peaceableness and inflicts conflict on them. Of course, that locks out 51% of the population. So it's an apt description on Roth's part of Jewish male alienation. But the viewer's point is well taken. I couldn't agree more with that assessment.
So there are 2 questions. One is from an anonymous attendee, and the other is from one of my colleagues here at UCSB, Professor Steve Zipperstein, who also is a very, very good friend, who teaches here at UCSB and also at UCLA. Mm-hmm. And so these 2 questions are related to one another. Okay, thanks. So I want to read these 2 questions together. Great. Could one argue that kibbutzim are representations of pastoral life? And then Professor Zipperstein writes, how would you compare and contrast American Jewish pastoralists with Israeli kibbutzniks?
Okay, great questions. My qualifications to answer the question derive not so much from my mother having been a kibbutznik, because anything I say on that account will be biased by all her stories. But it actually, just by absolute happenstance, about half an hour before this Zoom talk, I finished reading Eli Amir's novel, The Scapegoat, which was recommended to me and takes place against the backdrop of a kibbutz in the 1950s. and in particular involves, I guess it's an autobiographical novel on Amir's part. Amir came from Iraq, from Baghdad, and was one of these people who were sort of filtered into kibbutz life as an Oriental Jew, coming into the world of almost all Ashkenazim, some of whom, like my mother, were second generation. And yes, it's a pastoral dream, but I guess what's interesting, again, thinking about Amir's novel, is that it's not such a dream if you're an outsider to it. And so that novel really dramatizes the cultural clash that occurred on, at least on this one particular kibbutz, where Amir is brought, he's recruited in his teen years away from a refugee camp where other Arab Jews had been camped out, and they bring him into the kibbutz, and he does his utmost to try to fit in and to be a hard worker and to learn Hebrew and to do all the kibbutznik things. And to the end of the novel, he's reminded that he's an Arab, he's an outsider, he's an Easterner. So yes, it was a pastoral dream, and yes, like other pastoral dreams, it's a troubled one. It's a dream that also, of course, kibbutz life has changed enormously over the generations, and so what once was does no longer exists in that shape as it did in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So, but I think it's an interesting question to contemplate for sure.
Could I just intervene here for a second? I don't want to lose this important track, but you made the point just now that kibbutz life has changed enormously over the last almost century. But you could argue that some of the socialist kibbutzniks, I'm thinking of Aaron David Gordon, for example, and his very important treatise on what labor Zionism was about. Mm-hmm. He has this passage in Our Tasks Ahead where he talks about digging in the earth and getting your hands covered with the dust of the land of Israel. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, that's great. But then he adds, it cures alienation. And so all of a sudden, well, where did that come from? It's kind of this blend of Marxist industrial capitalism versus pastoral life in early 20th century Palestine. So I just wanted to interject that, but I'm sorry to interrupt. Are there any other comments that you want to make with regards to I'll just on the last question. I mean, I guess a point of consideration is, of course, just the obvious contrast between Israel and the United States. And I think that obviously these two novels that I talked about they're specifically addressing American pastoralism and the delusions that come from that. I don't think that either one of those novels is attempting to factor in, an Israeli perspective, a kibbutz perspective. But the question is still interesting. It's still an interesting one. If pastoralism is anathema to Jews everywhere, that would include Israel, that would include kibbutzim as well. And I guess to the extent that pastoralism is, by definition, is a form of escape and only exists against the backdrop of something you're trying to escape from, since we live in a complex and interconnected world, it does, to me, ultimately, it's doomed to fail. It's doomed to fail. It's doomed to fall short of its aspirations. Now we have many, many interesting questions, and I want to get a student first.
Okay, please.
This is an individual by the name of Jonathan Jolly, although he goes by the name Jolly.
Okay, all right, Jolly.
One of my favorite students this quarter.
Oh, I'm glad to hear.
He writes in, what kind of differences are there between Jewish American acculturation and other kinds of minority status acculturation? there is the idea that in America, your identity can become American, regardless of where you come from. So is this always an aspiration, or is there something unique about Jewish American experience?
Well, that's a great question, Jolly. I think that well, one element that I'll mention, just to go back to something I said earlier, is that arguably Jews have never been outsiders to have never been more outsiders to America than anyone else, because they were here from the founding, right? So if you look at early Jewish American history, you can see Jews present in North America and participating in North American life going back to the 1600s. So from not to say that they were welcomed with open arms, but here they were doing their things, particularly, they're building their lives and families and communities and so on. So it's not so much a group of people who are latecomers, adjusting to a place that already exists and having to learn how to become a part of it. They're already here. Now that, of course, is only true for a few thousand Jews who came here, let's say, in the years before the Civil War, but all the same, it creates a precedent. I think ultimately, I hate to oversimplify here, but I think in general, acculturation is complicated in America by the fact of race, and I think that's really what it comes down to. That if you can pass for white, as Jews began to do at various points in history, but certainly primarily in the post-World War II period, then you're afforded admission to areas of society that might be off limits for other people. So I think that is a factor as well. If there is anything, I would say, I'll just say one thing, Jolly, to not to attempt to tie this all up with a bow or anything, because I'm not sure how conclusive this is, but if there is anything distinct about the Jewish immigrant experience from other immigrant experiences, it would be this, and that is that immigrants from many other places, whether you're talking about Ireland or Italy or Puerto Rico or parts of Asia or wherever people have come from willingly, immigrants, right? I'm not talking about people who were brought here against their will. Those immigrant populations culturally were able to retain ties and wanted to retain ties to the lands of their ancestry. So Irish people wanted to stay connected to Ireland. Italian people wanted to stay connected to Italy. Puerto Rican people stay connected to Puerto Rico, go back and forth. Jewish immigrants to the United States didn't have a place to go back to, by and large, and didn't sentimentalize the places that they came from, at least until, maybe when you get to Fiddler on the Roof, you begin to see some sentimentalization of the shtetl. But for the most part, if you talk to, for instance, people of my grandfather's generation, my grandfather came here from Odessa in the 1890s, he didn't want to talk about Russia. Those people did not want to talk about those places. They never felt welcome there. They had no connections back there that they wanted to retain. And that is a distinct, that's an experience that's, I think, distinct to Jews as a deterritorialized people coming to America, in contrast with other immigrant groups, at least. Thanks for the question, Jolly.
Another question comes from one of our colleagues at Berkeley, Malcolm Feely. He's in the law school, emeritus professor of the Berkeley Law School. And he challenges the series of questions about the kibbutz and pastoralism. He writes, but kibbutzim were intensely communal and certainly not an individualist pastoral experience.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's in that way very distinct from, certainly distinct from both the scenarios in both of those novels where individualism poses a great threat. Yeah.
Another question comes from a very good friend and colleague in Los Angeles who is a dancer, Karen Goodman, and she writes, wasn't early Hasidism also pastoralist? Now, that's her question, but I want to just add a little something to it. Do you think that in Jewish American literature, you have examples where people try to put together in a significant way the pastoralist and the more traditional urbanist Jewish perspective on landscape?
I don't know, I don't know enough about Hasidism and the history of Hasidism in the United States to frankly, to even know that there was a pastoral element to it. The only knowledge I can refer to, and it won't be talking about Hasids by any means, where there's a pastoralist impulse involved, are turn of the 20th century Jews, mostly from places like the Lower East Side, who created farming colonies in places like New Jersey, not far from where I live, in a little town in the Berkshires called Sandusfield. There was a Jewish agricultural colony, let's say between 1905 and 1925. Of course, in Petaluma, California, if I know my history well, there was a group of socialist Jewish chicken farmers, right? So there's a pastoral impulse there, but to connect it back to the comment from the, I'm sorry, I don't remember the person's name, the law school person from Berkeley, those are communal endeavors. So the pastoralism there is of a different strain. I will say that in many instances, particularly the one instance that I know best is the one in rural southwestern Massachusetts, near where I live, that that pastoral experiment in communal pastoral Jewish life didn't work out very well for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that the Berkshires have very, very poor soil. And these aspiring Jewish farmers were given shovels and rakes. They had no agricultural knowledge. It was the Baron de Hirsch movement that settled them there. They didn't really know what they were doing. And in some instances, they practically, literally starved to death on the farm. The ones that were successful, and there are a few families that remain in that part of Massachusetts who first came there as part of this pastoralist, agriculturalist, communal experiment. Those were the families who had ties back in New York City, and also were able to basically industrialize their production of chickens and chicken eggs. In other words, they weren't pastoral, they were urban pastoral, right? So I think pastoralism that endeavors to separate itself from modernity and urban and industrial life, I think that is problematic. But of course, if people are realistic enough to, these chicken farmers, I guess the ones who made it were the ones who drove down to New York City twice a week to sell their kosher chickens to people on the Lower East Side. In other words, they did not cut their ties to the modern world. And that's why they were successful. Of course, that's just one instance, but.
So there's a little footnote that has come from Rabbi Chaim Beliak in Los Angeles, who writes, Fontana, California was another chicken farmer attempt.
Yeah, I think there's several, there's places, there are these attempts in places in Kansas, Louisiana. This is largely, late 19th century, early 20th century. A lot of it was Baron de Hirsch money. Some of the places panned out. I think the New Jersey communities lasted quite a while. I think even there was also southeastern Connecticut in the years before the World War II had a fairly large, I'm not sure how communal those endeavors were. They were, those were separate Jewish families living nearby as neighbors to one another. But there's certainly a pastoralist impulse there, and it's certainly a pastoralist impulse that motivated Baron de Hirsch to put money towards this in the first place, right? The idea of restoring Jews to the land was very much why Baron de Hirsch funded these programs in the first place.
And I just, there are a couple of more questions I want to touch upon. One is a continuation of Rabbi Beliak, who writes, Baron de Hirsch and the eggs and the chickens were sold in larger urban areas.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of small comment. And also Karen Goodman stayed, she writes that the Baal Shem stayed in the Carpathian Mountains and nature was important to him. So I was actually thinking that one might be able to argue that maybe Hasidism represents a kind of synthesis of the pastoral and the urban, these possibilities.
I'll have to look into that. I think, you know, the accompanying thing for, again, to go back to the two novels, you know, it's an important consideration that these two, well, in one case, the family, the Swedes family, and in the other case, in the Allegra Goodman book, the community, these are communities of people who are not trying to simplify their lives economically. They're not trying to get back to the basics. They are trying to escape from something that they don't like into a mythology, into a mythological landscape. But one of the greatest burdens that they carry with them is their privilege. Certainly the Swede, his privilege, right? He owns a factory. He owns a leather factory in Newark that employs, you know, hundreds of Black and Puerto Rican laborers. He's trying to kind of, you know, he wants to be able to leave the factory floor, and which is a realm of urban, modern, multiracial existence. He wants to be able to walk away from that every night into a pasture. And so it's a different kind of, it's a different form of withdrawal from these back to the land efforts. I mean, it's not unrelated, but it's different in that sense.
We're quickly coming to an end of our time with you, Michael, but I want to get one question of my own.
Sure. Please, Richard.
And I think the answer to this really leads into urging people to buy your book, 100 Acres of America, because I believe, as you said in the presentation early on, that the first two chapters deal with the third powerful spatial structure in American history. So the first is the urban, the second is the pastoralist, and the third is the West. Yeah. And Huck leaving the raft and going into the wilderness. Yeah. So could you comment very briefly, because we don't have much time left, about the West or the wilderness in...
I'd love to do that. So in that first, it's actually the first chapter of the book is what I call the frontier chapter. And I figure that's because historically the frontier precedes everything, right? That's the part of a landscape that a population encounters before they have built cities. And in that section of the book, I look at two 19th century travel narratives written by Jews. The first of which is incidents of adventure, incidents of travel and adventure in the far West. Solomon Carvalho, actually, he was a native of Charleston, where I am right now. He grew up in the Jewish community here in Charleston in the 1820s and 1830s. He became first he was a painter, and then he evolved from painting to daguerreotypes. Eventually, he was hired by John C. Fremont to be the expedition photographer for one of Fremont's trips across the Rocky Mountains. Fremont was trying to map a railroad route across the Rockies in the 1850s. And Carvalho goes along to take pictures. Tragically, the photographs, the glass plate photographs, are all lost except one of them. But Carvalho wrote a book about his travels, and that book involves him describing a lot of encounters with native people and a lot of snowstorms and day after day of slogging through, neck deep snow over passes in Colorado and Utah, what I found remarkable, and I guess, what I interpreted as a Jewish perspective was that, the Huckleberry Finn sort of individual going off by himself into modernity. In Carvalho's case, he celebrates every moment of communal togetherness. He likes to sit by the campfire with the Pawnee Scouts. He spends a period of time with some Mormons in Utah. He's actually very sick and injured when he gets there, and the Mormons nurse him back to health. And he describes the city of Salt Lake in very admiring words. In other words, Carvalho was fascinated by the West, not as a place to escape to, but as a place to sort of reignite civilization. In the end, he crosses the Rocky, makes it to Los Angeles, and he's considered to be one of the founders of the Jewish community in Los Angeles. So there's that. So the other book that I talk about is by a Czech-born German-speaking writer who traveled across the West, and particularly in California, Oregon, and Washington in the 1850s, just before the Civil War, describing the landscape of the American West as sort of a seedbed of a new Jewish revival. And I think he was a little bit out of his mind on that. The revival eventually took place. It didn't happen. There was a civil war that happened first. But in any case, these writers are really enthralled with the American frontier. But their Jewish perspective on the frontier is not the typical, James Fenimore Cooper version of it.
Thank you very much,
addresses
Michael.
Your question, Richard.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I just want to paraphrase one of the comments that is made in the question and answer as a way of thanking you. This person, who I know has participated in many, many, many Taubman symposia over the years, simply writes that this was the best Taubman symposium he has participated in. That's a high compliment.
Wow. You've had some heads of state there, haven't you?
Yeah. So,
yeah.
But before we leave, I do want to thank you, and also to note that to urge people who might want to buy that book of yours to go to Chaucer's, which is our local bookstore here in Santa Barbara. We all know it. And it's a very, very important bookstore. I've known the owner for 50 years. And so if you want to buy a copy of Michael's 100 Acres of America, taken from Philip Roth's American Pastoral, go to Chaucer's and look at that book and others that, of course, the thousands and thousands of books Mari Curley has at Chaucer's. And before we say goodbye, I also want to welcome, or to announce and welcome people to our next presentation, which will be on Sunday, the 13th of November, again at 3 p.m. And it's going to be with Graciela Makovsky, who's going to be talking about her book, The Prophet of the Andes, The Unlikely Journey to the Promised Land. And this is a part of our symposia on Jews in Latin America. And so I hope you'll join us on the 13th of November for Graciela Makovsky. And Michael, let me thank you again for this wonderful presentation that you've given us this afternoon. And I hope it will encourage people to go back to their bookshelves, find American Pastoral or something from Allegra Goodman, or maybe even an Israeli pastoralist novel like The Blue Mountain by Meir Shalev. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Taubman Symposium. Thanks all of you for attending. I'm sorry I can't actually see your faces, but I deeply appreciate your attention.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, Michael.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay.